Now, why in God's name I moved from Florida to Minnesota, I will never understand. You see, I am deeply Southern. And yes, let me put this argument to rest right now. Florida is part of the South. That's right. But I am not from subtropical Florida, you know, palm trees and orange groves and bougainvillea and booty shorts. No, I am from moss-draped, dirt road, panhandle Florida, where we are, as we like to say, country as hell, and proudly so. I am okra and Gulf Coast oysters, peanuts and field peas, mullet, not millet, but mullet, and grits, and the pot liquor swirling inside a bowl of collard greens. So, how was it that I landed 1,375 miles north on the tundra, trading sand for snow, sunburn for frostbite, in the land of 10,000 lakes, the land of lutefisk, the land of little smokies, and you know, those are those little bitty hot dogs. You put them in a crock pot, put a whole bunch of barbecue sauce over it, heat it up, and then have it at a Vikings tailgate with that. And then the land of baked concoctions called hot dish that the rest of us know as casseroles. See, by the time I moved to the Twin Cities, what's known as the Great Migration was largely already over. It began around 1910, and by the time it ended, about 1970, 6 million of us black folks had left the South for points north, west, and Midwest. Mechanization and poisons, such as pesticides, meant to control weeds and manage crops, and racism meant to control and manage the black folks who planted, grew, and picked the crops. Well, those things combined and drove us away in search of a better life. But by the time I left home for Minnesota in like the late 80s, things were really changing in the South. Black people were gaining political power. We had cities that beckoned us like Atlanta, and Charlotte, and Dallas. It was really only a trickle at first, but black people were steadily coming back to our homeland. Yet I left. I rose up in what historians say was the second much smaller stream of Southern African American migrants to head north, the post-integration generation. The truth is, I moved to the Twin Cities for a better paying newspaper job and for a skyline of skyscrapers rather than live oak trees. I plan to stay just 3-5 years at most, and then on to bigger and better things. So imagine my chagrin, if not my dismay, when one Saturday morning, 10 years later, I found myself walking down the concrete aisles of the Minneapolis Farmers Market alone. It was early fall, overcast and gray. The air had shifted from crisp to chilly, and there I was, wrapped in down, wandering past table after table of beautiful breads and bison jerky and wild rice and everything a hearty Minnesotan would want in her pantry. And even though I could say the most Minnesotan of phrases with ease and appropriate accent by then, like, oh, for sure, and you betcha, and oofta, deep down, I was not a Minnesotan. I was a black woman from the backcountry of North Florida. And for me, the truest expression of that identity was on a plate. But the okra in Twin Cities grocery stores was always too old and too hard and kind of gray. The oysters had to be flown in, and there was really only one soul food restaurant in town. Now that said, black people were only 3% of the state's population back then, kind of like where the black population is in this city now. I'm just saying. So, being that we were only 3% of Minnesota's residents, why was I complaining, right? Now, another group whose population in Minnesota was about as small as ours was back then was the Hmong community. They had fought with us in Laos as communism took hold of that region in the 1960s and 70s, in a conflict known as the Secret War. Anyway, rather than outright abandon the Hmong community once communism became the law of the land. And knowing that if we did leave them behind, it would be a death sentence, the U.S. began to airlift many out. Minnesota figures into this because it had a robust social service and refugee resettlement network. The first Hmong family arrived in St. Paul in 1975. Their migration bested mine by 5.5 times, 7,800 miles. So let me be Captain Obvious for a moment and say that Laos is mainly tropical and the growing season is long, and in that way, agricultural traditions of Hmong communities reach back for centuries. So drawing on that knowledge and skill was one of the early ways those newest of Minnesotans began to lay claim to this unfamiliar place. The growing season, yes, was shorter, but small community gardens sprang up, then exurban farms, and soon that bounty flooded the city's farmers markets. Still, the adjustment was hard. The language barrier was real. The first generation thought the second American-born generation wasn't keeping the old ways, and to top it off, it was winter, almost 9 months out of the year. And when you are far away from all you know, the cold can amplify your loneliness. So, I'm walking down the aisle at the farmer's market, going from table to table, glancing at the produce, and then I hear this voice call out, "I have collards for you." I look up, and this older Hmong gentleman was just smiling and just beckoning me towards his table, and I just stopped and kind of stared at him. And in my head, I'm like, wait a minute. The one black person you see around here and you think I want collard greens? What is this, some culinary racial profiling going on? What is happening here? I had my eye roll and my neck roll locked, loaded, and ready to deploy. But it was his smile. It was so genuine and so disarming, I had to kind of laugh at myself. It was as if he had been saving this prize of his labor, his talent, and skill, and he finally found someone who would appreciate it. I started laughing under my breath, and I walked over. His collards were pretty. The leaves were not too big. The color was just right. Kind of like new $1 bills. And as my Aunt Mabel had taught me way back in the country, collards are best picked after a cool night. They're more tender that way. So I gathered bunches, and he held open a bag, and I stuffed them in. And as I paid, he thanked me and told me to come back. Clearly, I had not been his first black customer, but I do feel sorry for any sister who came behind me that day because I left nary a leaf. In that moment, I'm not sure I realized it, but I do now. That gentleman and I were trying to make our way in a place that was not ours. Collard greens, fresh with dew, helped us, if only for a few moments, walk the road together. And although I cannot speak for him, I like to think they helped us feel like maybe we belonged and that this place could be home. Thank you for listening.